Now it gives me pleasure to introduce Sam Spinner, who's the Tandetnik Professor of Yiddish Language and Culture at Johns Hopkins. Sam is a guy that combines both literary scholarship and a knowledge of, I don't know, like Jewish rabbinic stuff. So he's sort of pitched for the cycle in many ways. He is an expert in Jewish and German culture and Jewish culture modernity. He was an undergrad at Hopkins, got his PhD at Columbia, was an assistant professor at UCLA, then did a postdoc at Hopkins, and is, luckily for us, back at Hopkins. And his first book, Jewish Primitivism, he's not going to talk mostly about that today, but it's really interesting because he talks about how Jews in the early 20th century and 19th century saw themselves as sort of savages and primitivists and primitive people, and how that interacted with various other notions of modernity, and how Jews could see the primitive in themselves and use that to understand the world. But his current project is about books and how books as a monument to the Holocaust and to the world after the Holocaust, Yiddish books. And so he's very interested in not just literary culture, but visual culture, material culture. He's a really interesting guy with doing interesting stuff. So please look forward to hearing him. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. And thank you everyone here for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very sorry I was late. As Zach said, I know lots of things, but not apparently about traffic. I'm lucky that my job, which brings me down here almost every day, never brings me down here at this time of the morning, which is school drop-off anyway. It was hazardous enough getting out of the house by the kids. I'm especially sorry for starting late, because I know that if you trace the history of this congregation back far enough over the decades and the splits and the offshoots, and I think I calculated it, if you go back through close to 200 years and 4 splits or offshoots, back to Chizuk Amuna, back to Baltimore Hebrew, back to Nidchei Yisrael, founded in 1830. They were German Jews, and you know, sticklers for time and punctuality. However, having said that, if they were truly German, then they would have abided by the ancient German custom of starting all lectures exactly 15 minutes late. It's a thing at German universities called the Akademische Viertelstunde. So I'm very happy to say that actually I was precisely on time and I started speaking at 8:15.
Only for a full professor.
That's true. So not there yet. Not there yet. So I'm going to talk today about, like Zach said, about things I'm interested in, related to my research project, but I'm not going to give you a research spiel. And I'm going to share with you some background info, very general background info on Yiddish, what it is, where it was. Okay.
You're good. You don't have to hold it.
Which you may know already, and then I'm going to jump forward and talk a little bit about Yiddish books that were published in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. And the reason why I'm interested in these books, well, they're interesting, aren't they, to everybody? And the reason I want to talk about it today is because the sad reality is that we know that people in general, Jews specifically, scholars even, we know very, very little about most of these books. Most Yiddish books published after the Holocaust were published in the context of, you know, obviously the massive decimation of European Jewish culture and the global dispersion of the survivors. And It was neither a promising, publishing landscape, but also it was a period that kicked off the dramatic decline of Yiddish as a vernacular. Which is also not great for selling books. And until very recently, nobody was in universities or academic contexts doing research on Yiddish. Very few exceptions. There's a few more of us now. And until recently, very few people were doing research on Yiddish literature that wasn't written by the classic writers, the most famous, Shalom Aleichem, Mendele Moichesforen, and so forth. Many of the books that I'm going to show you were written by no names, by people we don't know about. But literature and books are always much more than just the most famous books we know. They're always much more than simply the sort of epitome of a culture in that classical definition given to us by Matthew Arnold of a culture being the best, right, that a society has to offer. Literature, books show us almost everything that a society has to offer. I guess we're lucky living right now in a period of the preeminence of the internet and social media, and in a way the decline of print media, because for future scholars and historians, books will not actually contain a full record of our culture, and certainly not its worst moments. They'll have to turn to the Twitter archives for that. But until very recently, books told us a lot, and they still do. And if we want to know about the survivors of the Holocaust, their lives, their ideas, the books they were writing, we need to start by picking up those books and just reading them. So I'm just going to show some to you to give you an idea of what Holocaust survivors were doing. There's an extra reason why I've found this work particularly resonant recently. I'm sure you've all noticed that in most discussions touching on any aspect of anything Jewish in the aftermath of October 7th, the Holocaust has emerged as a key catalyst for argument or cudgel for debate, and for every side of every possible issue. And of course, that's a fair game. You can use historical events and our memories and knowledge of historical events to make arguments. But what has always struck me is the complete absence of any awareness or knowledge of, well, what did the Holocaust mean to the people who experienced it and died but left us a record of what they thought, or survived and continued to write and let us know. So it turns out that, and I'll show you a range of things, it turns out that like all human beings, they all thought different things. The Holocaust never meant any one thing, or maybe not any one thing, any two things in opposition to each other. It didn't mean to the survivors never again this or never again the other thing. To a lot of them, it didn't have anything to do with never again at all. The Holocaust meant a lot of different things, and I'm still discovering the range of those things. And so I'll show you a couple of books to give you some ideas. First, a few words about Yiddish, since Yiddish is obviously the most interesting language.
I have to share the screen.
And the best language, objectively, right? And this is something that you all know. Your fellow congregants is a distinguished local Yiddish poet, the distinguished local Yiddish poet.
The bar's in the ground.
But also somebody who agrees objectively from a scholarly standpoint that Yiddish is the best and most interesting language. So I'm sure he's talked to you about that before. A little bit of history if you've zoned out when Zach is telling you about interesting things to do with Yiddish. Here is simply a map of the heartland of Yiddish showing the various dialects, but also basically the breakdown of where it was spoken.
Is that not working?
It's working everywhere but on the screen. Oh, there we go. Okay, so Prussia, right here we have the middle of Germany here, western edge. In the Middle Ages, what Yiddish and what became Yiddish started being spoken down here in the Rhineland. And then we get a big population explosion in the early modern period. The period when Jews moved in increasing numbers, and the population of the communities that had moved came eastward into Bohemia and Prague, right? And Central Europe became kind of the center of Jewish European life and of Yiddish literature and culture, and that's where the language really coalesced as the main language of European Jews for everything except for, and this is how it remained until the Holocaust, for everything except for written down rabbinic and certain institutional texts. So rabbis almost always wrote their books and their decisions and things like that in Hebrew, but sermons were from the late Middle Ages onward delivered in Yiddish. All business, all Torah study, everything, all Yiddish. It's throughout this area as Jews moved into Central Europe and then northward, northeast, and eastward, eventually reaching the sort of greatest population concentration in Poland, in Galicia, and then into what became the Russian Empire, right? So that's kind of the geographic trajectory of Yiddish and the timescape as we start in the Rhineland around 1000, and we move over the centuries eastward, and the borders that we're looking at here are the borders from 1815. And that's kind of the last period in which political borders ended up, and this is kind of an interesting thing if you're into sociolinguistics, the political borders matched the internal Jewish borders. So when we say things like, oh, he's a Litvak, right? It doesn't mean he's from where Lithuania is now. He could be from places that are now in northeastern Poland, or most of Belarus, or Latvia, right? Because in that period, pre-1815, Lithuania was something bigger. Same thing with Polish, with Hungarian. These Jewish cultural and linguistic definitions map onto earlier political borders that existed long enough for Jewish communities to kind of coalesce their diversity in those different ways. And here you get a clearer map of what it looks like in terms of the dialect. So north. Oops.
Did you?
Oh, I changed the one on my screen, but not here. Here we go. The green and that's Litvish Yiddish. So if you're speaking to Sholem, that's what he's going to talk with you. I speak Southeastern. My father was from Chernovitz, and that's where that is. And if you speak to almost anybody else in the world nowadays who speaks Yiddish, 90% or upwards of whom are Hasidic Jews, they speak a dialect that is derived from the blue. So maybe with a little bit of the red there. So Central Yiddish, Polish Yiddish, Hungarian Yiddish. And linguists are in agreement that the Yiddish that Hasidim speak now has become its own dialect, called New, what do they call it, Zach? New Hasidic Yiddish, New American Hasidic Yiddish, something like that. But let's go all the way back. This is a picture of the first appearance of a Yiddish sentence.
Huh.
But you can't actually see it. Oh, look at it again. Because it's written in red inside those Hebrew letters. What you're looking at is a page from the Worms Machzor, Machzor, not just for high holidays, but it was a prayer book for everything the entire year. And this was from Worms, one of the ancient Jewish communities in Western Germany. So it's a prayer book, and it's from 1272. And written inside those Hebrew letters at the top of the page is the first known complete sentence of Yiddish, 1272.
And what does it say?
Hmm?
And what does it say?
What did it say?
I'm desperately trying to remember the whole.
Don't forget the locks.
It says something, I don't remember the exact words, but the sense is, whoever carries this prayer book into the synagogue will be blessed, something like that.
It's not a curse.
You know what, it's actually, I can quickly look it up. I'll read you what this, I'm not connected to the internet, okay. If one of you wants to look it up, you can type in Worms Machzor and it'll come up. I'm sure it even has a Wikipedia page. And then I can, but you know what, I was able to log on here. So the sentence is, it's still too small even when I blow it up on my screen here. All right.
We liked what you said the first time.
It should be a quick question. The problem is I have a terrible memory. I remember during my qualifying exams when I was in grad school, it was pretty bad because I would say, well, when you think about, this book, the title will come to me in a minute, published in 19 something. So at least I got 1272 here. So that's the first sentence in Yiddish. We have written words in Yiddish from before that, going back a couple of centuries. The earliest example are probably from a text that is present in this very building, Rashi's commentary on the Talmud. In Rashi's commentary, he has hundreds of French translations. When there's tricky Aramaic or Hebrew words that he can't explain with other Hebrew words, French translation. It's got about 30 or 40 Yiddish words. It's a linguistic debate whether these are German or Judeo-German or Yiddish. I'm going to go with Yiddish. There was a question back.
No, I forgot the quote.
Oh, yeah.
It's good Tag, the Tag is there, this Machzor and basic Knesset Tag.
Here you
So
go.
let a good day shine for him who will carry this Machzor to the synagogue.
Thank you. What's interesting is that these Machzorim were usually housed in the synagogues because they were so rare, and that was often the safest place to keep them. But they were also created for wealthy individuals. So this one was likely somebody's personal Machzor.
So this is
And-
manuscript?
This is a manuscript, and we don't know, but it probably simply would have been the request of the owner from the scribe. Hey, could you put that neat little blessing that I heard the other day somewhere? Here's a manuscript page of the Cambridge Codex from 1382. This is the oldest known Yiddish book manuscript, not just a sentence. Now we're scaling up to books. 1382, oldest known. So if, we have a sentence from 1272, but we know from other linguistic and historical evidence that Yiddish goes back to 1000, where are all the other books? Well, Christians were burning them the whole time. Periodically in different places. It wasn't just a continuous autodafé, but as Jewish communities were expelled, either they would leave behind books, which were then pulped or recycled. It's actually a very fascinating project being done by scholars somewhere, I don't remember where, who are now looking for scraps of Hebrew, and they're finding Yiddish manuscripts in the bindings of medieval and late medieval Christian texts, many thousands of them, because this was good paper. You couldn't rewrite on it unless it was very thick parchment, you could scrape it off, but otherwise you could use it to rebind books. There was a lot like that, and that's where these books went. They were reused, they were pulped, or they were burned, and they were burned in huge numbers. So this kind of evidence is extremely hard to find, extremely rare, and we're fortunate when we have it. This book from 1382, the Cambridge Codex, the only reason we have it is the Cairo Geniza. You heard of the Cairo Geniza? So somehow, for some reason, a Yiddish manuscript showed up in Cairo, and whoever had it was done with it. And then one day somebody was like, oh man, what am I going to do with this? Put it in the Geniza. And there it sat for 600, 500 years. And now we have it. It contains, well, it's the oldest complete Yiddish book we have. What do you think it contains?
Please send money.
Hmm?
Please send money.
Some sort of story of what's, I'm not sure if it's a created story or if it's just like a parable type of thing.
Uh-huh.
Diary.
Diary. Nobody wants to guess, like communal ordinances or halacha. No? Good.
Contributions to the synagogue?
No, it's stories, not just stories. It's epics, medieval epics, chivalric epics. These are medieval Yiddish epics about knights and princesses and all that stuff, right? That you thought only the Christians had. No, there were Yiddish, Jewish epics. And when I say Jewish, I don't just mean Christian epics translated into Yiddish. They were turned into Jewish epics. The
Are
characters
these
had-
called Bubba Minces? A Bubba Minsa?
Not really, only retrospectively.
Hasidic tales?
Definitely not Hasidic. It's Hasidism wasn't invented for another 400 years.
So these
Um,
are Jewish knights?
These were kind of Jewish knights. I mean, the idea of a knight in chivalry is extremely Christian, but Jews were living in an extremely Christian society, and their culture took on the culture of the people and the place they lived in. And this is something, when I moved to Baltimore, I was shocked to discover still happens in Jewish communities, when everybody started wearing purple one Friday. I was like, what is, my children go to school at Beth Tefillah, and I was like, I don't know about a custom of wearing purple on this Friday. Like, oh, that's not a Jewish thing, that's the Ravens. So we still apparently do this cultural adaptation. I don't wear purple, but I acknowledge that there are people in my very community for whom that's important.
My Jews wear red on Fridays.
Hmm?
In Kansas City, we wear red on Fridays.
So,
It only works until the playoffs.
no further comment. So here we have medieval epics. That's the first book we have. It's not anything that you would think is Jewish, but it's great stories. So I could give a whole other thing about these medieval epics. They're very cool. They have Jewish names, and some of them are even based on biblical stories, but they turn it into this kind of medieval style dramatic adventure-y thing. And since we're talking about a weird confluence of Yiddish and medieval stuff, check this out.
Does that show up on yours? Like
Yeah.
that's
That was the first emoji from 1381.
What's that mean?
Well, that's disappointing.
With an exclamation point?
Is it not on this?
It's not.
All right.
Is it on yours?
Yeah.
Oh,
It looks like an triangle. with an
Well, yeah, no, that's okay. So here's
yeah.
Beautiful German concept.
that's so strange. Oh, because you opened it in Google? So they ate it somehow. All right, it's okay. Put it back on play. I have a close-up of it. Somebody knows what it is. I heard it.
I read this beautiful German crossbow.
Beautiful German crossbow. Here's a close-up of an ivory inlay. Okay, so there's a crossbow from about 1460. It's actually the earliest precisely dated crossbow that we, people who are interested in crossbows, I guess, have evidence of. There's no other crossbow with a definite date of creation. 1460, made for some German duke, and it's now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the beautiful Arms and Armor Gallery. And if you inspect it carefully, you'll see on an ivory inlay on this crossbow made for a German duke. Need I say that he was Christian and did not speak Yiddish, and almost certainly couldn't read Hebrew. Here's a little Yiddish phrase. And here's what it says. Oh, sorry. Google couldn't handle my two directions. Hab gut lieb hoch Herze, which means something. It's a sort of cryptic phrase, and it's not entirely clear. There's a few grammatical options, but it means something like hold God dear and be in high spirits. Scholars think that it's a cryptogram. That's a kind of like secret code, a puzzle that relates to a phrase or a sort of quip or proverb that that particular duke really loved or was associated with his noble house. Why there is a Yiddish cryptogram on a duke's fancy crossbow and who made it? But it's cool, so I thought I'd show it to you. And now we're going to fast forward to the vorwärts, to the forward. We're going to fast forward about 1,000 years. And to skip up to what the landscape of Yiddish was within the living memory, perhaps, of possibly some people here or in our community, shortly before World War II. Just a random front page from the Vorwärts newspaper. Anybody former subscribers to the Forward here?
My mother was.
Grandparents.
Yeah? Not the Morgan Journal?
My daughter's a publisher.
Really? Well, you can't really subscribe to a print edition anymore, but I suppose if your daughter's the publisher, you presumably are, at least you get the newsletter or you're signed up for their website. So at its peak, the circulation was 275,000. That was mostly in New York. New York had a couple of million Yiddish speakers. There were around 1910, I think 5 or 6 daily Yiddish newspapers. Vorwärts had the biggest circulation, 275,000, but you put it all together, that's just a lot of Yiddish newspapers, a lot of Yiddish speakers. And it was simply their vernacular. This was a fully normal newspaper, not a Jewish interest newspaper or website the way it has become now, reporting on mostly on Jewish news and cultural matters and politics. This was just a general newspaper. Roosevelt's Labor's Choice, there was a political affiliation with the Forward. If you preferred a religious newspaper, there was one of those. A more conservative or centrist newspaper, there was one of those. If you were an outright communist, you also had a newspaper.
Anarchist. Anarchist,
There you go. There were newspapers for almost every flavor in Yiddish because there were lots and lots of Yiddish speakers in New York and around the world.
Which dialect did they use for these particular ones?
Newspapers wrote, newspaper articles were written in newspaper Yiddish. In the same way that, well, not in exactly the same way that, you know, the New York Times or the Washington Post, their articles are not in normal English. The articles are not in normal English because I think just the quality of the writing is terrible. But there are conventions that people use to write in newspapers. There's a lot to say about that, but there isn't really a dialect. It's
But
sort
all the
of,
Yiddish speakers could read them.
yes, absolutely.
But for particular, they would never write azay, they'd say azoy. If it was, like, it wouldn't, it would be more like a Warsaw standard is what I understand.
That's complicated. In terms of spelling, that's also complicated. Yiddish didn't have a standardized spelling until Reb Shalom, when did YIVO release its standardized orthography?
I was gonna say late 20s, early 30s.
Late 20s, early 30s. YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, released an official standardized orthography. But that means very little because the vast majority of Yiddish books that have been published since then never knew about it or cared much about it. And certainly Hasidic Jews now have their own spelling conventions, which are not fully standardized, but the sort of implicit standards are not YIVO's. Hasidic newspapers have also their own sort of register. What does newspaper Yiddish sound like? How is newspaper Yiddish spelled? So spelling, it's complicated, but already by the late 19th century, by the time a newspaper register started developing, you wouldn't see so much things associated with the pronunciation of divergent dialects written out. So the example given here was the kind of most striking distinction between the Litvish dialect and all the others, the pronunciation of the cholam, the oi. So toire, I would say Polish Jews, Hungarian Jews. A Litvak will say teire, the name Moshe, Meshe. So you would very rarely see that written out. In letters that people wrote to each other, then you would see more often because people don't know how to spell a word that diverges from how they pronounce it. Why would you think that it's spelled one way? And so you often see dialect pronunciation written that way, but that doesn't make it into newspapers. So the implicit standard does correspond probably more to a sort of Central Yiddish. And there's a lot of German in there because German was sort of the model language in Central Europe for newspapers, for intellectual culture. And to this day in Hasidic newspapers, you still have a lot of German words that were never colloquial Yiddish words, but became standard newspaper words. For example, the word for maybe in Yiddish, how do you say maybe? Efshe. Kenzan. So you would think you would write a newspaper Efshe. You see often in newspapers back then and Hasidic newspapers now, vielleicht, which is just German. Okay, so 1939 approximately, this is what the sort of demographic breakdown of Yiddish looked like. Eastern and Central Europe, close to 7 million. Probably a little more. This seems like these numbers seem like a bit of a low ball for me, but these numbers are based on a number of different studies and statistic sources, whereas my vibes feeling is not based on anything, so I didn't change the chart. North America, 3 million, Western Europe, you can see there Palestine, South and Central America, that seems especially low to me. I would say that in Argentina alone, you had something like 2 to 250,000 Yiddish speakers from Poland primarily. And then throughout, obviously Argentina, Buenos Aires was a major center of immigration in the teens, 20s, and 30s. But plenty of Eastern European Jews went all over the rest of South America and throughout Latin America, including many, many to Mexico. So you have a total in 1939, prior to the Holocaust, of 10 to 11, some people think maybe 12 million Yiddish speakers worldwide. And we know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. About 5 million of those Jews were Yiddish speakers. So can anybody do the quick math? What percentage is that? But
80%.
50%.
a little above 80% of the murdered Jews killed in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. And they constituted close to 50% of the total pre-war Yiddish speaking population. So that's a massive, just dramatic loss of speakers of the language, and then the communities that sustain a language, and then the things that you need, the institutions, the buildings, to do the things we do with languages, the printing presses, the bookstores, and on and on. All of that was destroyed throughout Central and much of Eastern Europe, but not all of it. So it sounds like the kind of thing, 85% of the Holocaust Jewish victims were Yiddish speakers. Almost 45% of the total pre-Holocaust Yiddish speakers were killed in the Holocaust. It sounds like the kind of thing, the numbers that match what it seems to me the sort of general knowledge or assessment of Yiddish is in Jewish communities here, just 80 years removed from the end of the war, which is that Yiddish was wiped out and it was the end of Yiddish. Now, that's not true. Nowadays, as you know, every synagogue has a resident Yiddish poet. Maybe only one does, your lucky synagogue. But there's close to 1 million Yiddish speakers, maybe a highball number, let's say 800,000 to 1 million ultra-Orthodox or Hasidic Yiddish speakers, or native Yiddish speakers. But that's the vast majority of Yiddish speakers. The diversity, the social and cultural and religious diversity of Yiddish-speaking Jews was decimated and was dramatically reduced. And of course, the knowledge of that diversity, the knowledge of that culture, of those societal and communal variations and gradations, all of that knowledge seems to me in our community, Baltimore Jews, but more broadly, not just us, all Jewish communities globally, at least the ones that I'm familiar with. Knowledge of that world is not so far away, right? Within lifetimes of some people still alive, certainly parents, grandparents, the world that they came from and the language that they spoke, that's kind of gone. It's crazy to think that 80 years ago, 75 years ago, if you had gone into most any synagogue in Baltimore, of course not the great ancient German synagogues like Beth Am or Chizuk Hamuna, but Yiddish would have been either simply the language of most people or easily understood. And now it's extremely rare to be able to find somebody to speak Yiddish with outside of a Hasidic ritual. And with the loss of the language goes the loss of our knowledge of, like I said, the culture, the society, the community, the politics, what they felt, what they thought. And something that I've noticed, and this is what motivates my current research, kind of at a deep root level, is that we've filled in those blanks in many ways. with what we prefer or what we think they would have thought or done or what should be. One of the places where we filled in the blanks is in our knowledge of what the Holocaust meant to the survivors, to the generation of survivors, to the bearers of that language, that culture, that enormous diversity that was a global culture. Okay, so I'm going to show some pictures of books, and then if you wipe off the lox grease from your hands, I've got some to pass around. And what I'm going to show you when I show you these books is that Yiddish survived the Holocaust in large part because Yiddish speakers before the Holocaust were already all over the world. New York by 1939 was undoubtedly the center of Yiddish publishing worldwide. Not the vast majority, but the most Yiddish books from any publishing center in the world were published in New York. Warsaw came in second, and Warsaw was maybe better for like the highbrow stuff. Warsaw, of course, was devastated. New York was not. Buenos Aires was not. Moscow was not. Kiev was not. These were all centers of Yiddish publishing. Tel Aviv, Paris, even strange, distant places like Melbourne and Chicago had Yiddish publishing. So here, let's look at some books. And my objective here is just to show you a sampling of the kind of things. Because it's important also to recognize that one of the things that we kind of assume must be the case is that from 1945 onward, everything about Yiddish and Yiddish culture was just Holocaust, cast in shadow. The entirety of it was about the survival of and the endurance of and the continuing now to live in the shadow of mass death of the Holocaust. That was a lot of it. Huge trauma that our communities have still not quite processed. But it wasn't all of it. So here's a fun example.
How much Yiddish books were written?
We're going to get there. That's going to be my last example. And I was going to bring a Yiddish book to show you, but they're also very heavy. So I left mine at home, but I have some pictures to show you. So Yiddish books ended up being a lot of it, but not all of it. Here we have a book called Pariser Historische Collagen. If you know French there, you can read the French translation, which appeared opposite the title page in Yiddish. The whole book's in Yiddish, but there, because it was printed in Paris in 1965, l'esprit parisien à travers le siècle, the Parisian spirit throughout the centuries. Nothing to do with the Holocaust, right? Just a kind of fun, weird book. Paris, 1965. Okay, so in Paris, there was a pre-war expatriate community of Jews, mostly from Poland, and they were still there. Many of them, obviously, many were deported and murdered in Auschwitz and elsewhere, but there were still many after the war. Many more refugees came. Yiddish publishing happened, not just in 45 and 46, but as long as there were Yiddish writers and speakers, they were publishing books that they were interesting for the writers to write, interesting for readers to read, that were simply published because Yiddish was a language that you wrote and read books in. Not because, like with Yizkor books, it was the language of the destroyed community. Here's another fun example, beautiful example, from Rio de Janeiro, 1949. It's a Yiddish translation of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, translated by Naftali Gross, who was a well-regarded Yiddish writer and translator. And I don't know who did the design. I haven't been able to find that out yet, but it's just stunningly beautiful. And this particular book is going on auction in a few days. So please don't bid on it. I'm hoping to get it for a steal. But I couldn't resist showing you the picture. So that's Rio de Janeiro. We have Paris. We have Rio de Janeiro, 1949, fancy artistic edition of the Song of Songs. Here we have Well, that is a well-known Holocaust book, perhaps the best-known Holocaust book, The Diary of Anne Frank. The first Yiddish translation, it ended up being translated into Yiddish 2 or 3 times. This was published in Bucharest, in Romania, in 1958. Okay, so Bucharest, 1958. I mentioned strange exotic locales for Jews to live. This book was published in one of those strange locales, just about 40 miles away from where I grew up, Toronto, Canada. This book was published in Toronto, Canada. This is a Yizkor book. The title is Lublin. It's about the city of Lublin, and it's by Nachman Shemen, who was a Yiddish writer who settled in Toronto, 1951. Nachman Shemen published a lot, was a prolific writer, and was one of the people who kind of got in on what became an extremely important type of book for the generation of survivors, which is Yizkor books. Yizkor books, very briefly, are books that do the work of Yizkor. When we say Yizkor and Shul on the high holidays and on the Shalosh Regalim, we're commemorating family members who have died. These books commemorate individuals because in the books are many different types of articles written by survivors or people who left before the war but remembered, oh, here's an article about the rabbi, here's an article about the first doctor to start a Jewish clinic in 1870, here's an article about the school I went to. There are also lists of people. Some of these books had lists of people who they knew survived and where they lived. Some of them would have, any pictures that that people had managed to bring out with them. They would publish those pictures, little captions. This is so-and-so. This is the 3rd grade class, the Cheder class from whatever year. And many of these books were written collaboratively. And the way that they were organized, right? We say Yizkor about a person, and we name the person in the Yizkor prayer. These books were almost every single one organized by place. This was how most European Jews, one of the most meaningful ways that they were able to sort of coalesce their knowledge of, their memory of what they lost around place. And it could be a city like Lublin, a big city. Some Yizkor books were written for like little towns, a little shtetl. Some Yizkor books were written for regions, and some for like entire Jewish regions. The one that I started bringing out of my house, but then, is an amazing Yizkor book published in 1951 called Lithuania. So the scale, the geographic scale of these books expands and contracts, and eventually what you get is, that's the picture I want to show you there. That's a picture from Yad Vashem, one of the most striking rooms in the building. Towards the end, there's the research center. And if you go into the research center, they have the Yizkor books lined up on this enormous, curved, sweeping wall of bookshelves. And they have put them into kind of uniform boxes. Yizkor books, obviously, it wasn't published by one press. They're not uniform. Most of them are quite large. Like we're talking, 12 by 8 inches or bigger. A lot of them glossy paper, hundreds of pages, very heavy, quite big. And the total number of Yizkor books that ended up being published, some still come out to this day. We don't really know. Nobody's ever done a complete bibliography. It's around 1,000.
You're still being published.
Some are. It's obviously they're changing now. It's different now that the vast majority of survivors are no longer with us. The majority of Yizkor books were published in the first 20 years after the Holocaust. The majority of those were published in Yiddish. The second largest number, which I think eventually in the 60s and 70s became the majority, were written in Hebrew. because Israel was, of course, a major center for post-war migration, and because the sort of cultural network and network also of publishers and historians who advised these projects and wrote a lot of the articles was still very strong in Israel, where there was Yiddish and Hebrew publishing. So even though many of these were written by groups in the United States, Landsmannschaften, groups of survivors from one place or another, they would end up, and the ones in the United States were almost always written in Yiddish. They would often end up being published or kind of sent to an editor, maybe in Israel, if not one of the other main places like New York or Buenos Aires, where Yiddish books were published. So it was usually lay people, usually writing in Hebrew, but often working with editors or historians who could kind of help them organize the work and provide them with information that, you know, ordinary people don't have access to, statistics and so on, because these books also often contained historical background and essays. So it was a very expansive concept of memory. What are you remembering? Not just family members who died, but the whole world as far as you could grab it. And
copies of these books would be published?
it depends.
Doing a book, would there be many copies or just a few copies?
It depends. So here I can now pass around a couple of books
Yeah, that's fine.
to give you an example of what some of these, not Yizkor books, but equivalent books might or did look like. Coming around on this side, the hard copy there, the little green book, is a book called Malke of Shiani Detzelt, which is was published in 1946 by Mark Turkov in Buenos Aires. And Mark Turkov eventually, that was book number 1 in a book series that he put together, and he called it Das Polnische Judentum, Polish Jewry. The book series ended up totaling 175 volumes. And his idea in the preface to maybe the first, but maybe the second or third, I don't quite remember, but he wrote a few prefaces to these volumes, and he said what the project was. And he said it in language that that reflects what was subsequently heard or you'd see in a lot of other memorial projects. His aim was to produce a document of and a memory of, a record of all of Polish Jewry, all of it. The culture, the history, the society, the religion, every aspect. He wanted to produce a record of it, a document of it. He also says a mirror of it. He also wants to continue creating it from Buenos Aires after the Holocaust, to create, to produce, right? It's kind of all encompassing. So in the end, he goes for 175 volumes, because how does such a project end? I'm not exactly sure why he ended it in 1946. My guess is he ran out of sponsors and funding for the project. But here we have book number 1 coming around. And this book series has a lot of firsts and also reflects the diversity of Yiddish literature in that post-war period, in those 2 decades. So the series is not all about the Holocaust, the book series. There's novels in it. There's novels about the Holocaust, but there's also just novels about whatever novels are about. Families, fighting, whatever. There's books of poetry in it. There are works by professional historians, histories of the Holocaust, but also histories of Jewish life in Poland and in Poland adjacent places throughout the ages. Every type of book that you can imagine is represented there, including what is one of the very first Yizkor books, which is volume number 4 in the book series, dedicated to the shtetl Sokolov. So in addition to publishing books that everybody with kinds of books that everybody was familiar with, like novels and poems and history books, he was also publishing books that were kind of new versions of old books to try to respond in some way to what had been lost. And so number 4 is called Manchurev Shtetl Sokolov, My Destroyed Town Sokolov. Unlike most subsequent Yizkor books, which were collaboratively written, this had one author. And by the way, the one that I showed earlier by Nachman Shemin about Lublin, also a single author. So the majority, multiple collaborative authorship, but some of them were written by individuals. And he presented, like Turkov, a sort of rationale for and understanding of what the books should do. And what he says in his introduction is, in Sokolov, you can't go to the cemetery and daven at the graves of your family members. The cemetery doesn't exist anymore. It was plowed under. Not a shard of gravestones remains. And anyway, you know, he doesn't write this, but in the background, 1946, who's going back if they're in New York or in Buenos Aires? He says, use this book instead. This book should be a matzeva. Hold this book, take it out, and think of your lost family members in the lost town of Sokolov. That was number 4. That was a kind of new type of book that appeared in the book series. Number 1 that's going around is one of the most important new types of books that developed in Yiddish and in any language since the Holocaust, which is a Holocaust testimony. It was written down by the editor, Mark Turkov, but it was delivered by a young woman, 19 years old, called Malka Ovshiani. Malka had been in a series of ghettos, then concentration camps, and survived, and was in a DP camp in Sweden. She had last been in a concentration camp in northern Germany, was in a DP camp in Sweden in the summer of 1945, just after liberation. Every day in the DP camps, when the Red Cross or the local postal service came with mail, everybody would frantically and desperately want hope for some evidence of family members who were alive. Usually they didn't get it. One day Malka got a letter from her father, who was in Buenos Aires, and who sent her a ticket to come join him. So she went 2 months after being liberated from a concentration camp, and she arrived in Buenos Aires. I believe the first Holocaust survivor to arrive in Latin America. And Mark Turkov, this editor and this writer, met her and said, tell me what happened, what you saw, what you experienced. So she told him, Malka Ovshiani erzählt. Malka Ovshiani tells. She arrived in late November 1945. Turkov writes down her testimony then and there, prepares it for print. This book that's going around, that's stalled over there, was printed in March 1946. Okay, March 1946. Malka, 6 months earlier, had just gotten out of a concentration camp. A year prior to that was in the camps. March 1946, this Holocaust testimony comes out. Immediate, the impulse to create a book, a literary document, a thing you can hold, a thing you can read, and to activate the entire network of how we make books. Writing, typing, editing, printing, putting it into action to create a record of something unprecedented, but using something so integral to Jewish culture and history, that is books. And that kicked off a book series that ended up going for, like I said, 175 volumes. And it touched on everything. And that was just one example of one type of book from one place, Buenos Aires. Going around here, we have another one, a pamphlet written by a survivor nobody's ever heard of, published in 1946. And here is another book from 1946, a magazine, a historical journal. 1946, Jews were already producing historical scholarship about the Holocaust. So 1946, testimonies underpinning a big publishing venture. Another one, a testimony that looks like it was self-printed, it's stapled together by some random person. 1946, historical journals, and all of it in Yiddish. All right, if you want to read these, talk to me, I'll tell you where you can learn Yiddish.
Thank you. And we normally have some time for Q&A. If you have time to sit
Yep.
around and people have, and I know there are things that you have to share. Thank you so much. I'm
Thank
sorry
you.
we have to.
No, of course, and I'm
Yeah.
sorry for being late.
Um,
Thank you all for your attention, for staying
yeah,
as long as you
thank
have.
you. I just want to remind everyone, last